I have kept the same logbook for 11 years, and it is only in the last month that I have started to doubt whose hand fills it. My name is Ansel Voth, and I am a Grain Warden, 3rd class, aboard the Emperor's Oak, a mass conveyor of the Munitorum fleet. Registry number lost to me now, the way most numbers are lost to a man who has spent his life counting other things. We haul tithe grain between 3 agri-worlds and a hive anchorage nobody on this ship has seen with their own eyes, only heard of, the way you hear of the Emperor's throne room or the far side of a moon. The voyage is 4 years each way, if the warp is kind, and the warp is rarely kind, so it is usually 5. And sometimes it is 6, and once, before my time, it was 11, and the manifest for that crossing is not spoken of. Though it is not forbidden either, it is simply the sort of thing nobody brings up over the recaf urn. I tell you this because a man who does not know a ship cannot understand what happened in her, and I did not understand it either. Not for most of my life on her decks, and I am not certain I understand it now. Only that I have stopped being able to look away from it. The oak is old. Not old the way a man is old, with his joints going and his hair going, but old the way a cathedral is old, where the wear has become part of the design, and nobody can say any more which parts were built and which parts were simply always there. Her lower holds run for 2 kilometers of grain vault, silo after silo after silo, each one the size of a hab block, each one fed by conveyor belts that groan, a specific groan I could pick out of 1,000 ships blind. I know that groan the way I know my own breathing, because for 11 years my duty has been to walk those holds with a lantern and a ledger, checking moisture, checking rot, checking for the small grey weevils that get into the grain, despite every rite the Administratum chaplain performs over the seed stock before we ever leave port. It is not glamorous work. It is not even especially safe work, not in the sense that void war is dangerous. But there are things that can happen to a man alone in 2 kilometers of dark grain for 6 years that nobody thinks to warn him about. Because nobody thinks a grain warden's life is worth the warning. I am telling you about the ledger because that is where it started, or at least that is where I noticed it starting. Though I have come to understand that a thing can be underway for a very long time before a man notices it. It was a 6th day, 3rd bell, no, 4th bell, because the grain lifts had already cycled by the time I came down, and the lifts only cycle after 4th bell rings through the hold vox. I had my lantern, my ledger, my chalk for marking the silo doors that needed resealing. Routine. The kind of routine a man could do with his augmetic lungs switched to half power and his mind on his supper. I opened silo theta 9, which I have opened perhaps 400 times in my service, and reached for the hanging ledger hook to note the moisture reading, and found that the previous week's entry was already filled in my hand. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only thing I have to offer you. It was not a hand similar to mine. It was not the careless mimicry of a bored deckhand playing a joke on the Grain Warden, which does happen, and which I have had happen to me twice before in lesser ways, a chalk mark rubbed out, a lantern oil topped up as a courtesy, small things. This was my actual hand. The particular slant I give my 7s, which my old tutor servitor on my home world beat into me, because I would not stop making them look like ones. The way I always underline the word clear when a silo passes inspection, a habit so specific to me, that another Grain Warden, a woman named Iset Cray, who has the vault 2 decks below mine, once remarked on it, because she said it looked like I was trying to convince someone. The entry was dated the previous 6th day. I had not made it. I had been in the mess hall the previous 6th day, I was nearly certain, eating the grey protein loaf and listening to a rating from the engine deck complain about a valve. And I had most certainly not walked 2 kilometers down to Theta 9 and written a moisture reading in a ledger I did not remember opening. I did what any sensible man does with a thing he cannot explain. I decided I had simply forgotten. 6 years is a long time to keep the same ledger, and a man's memory is not a cogitator, however much the tech priests would like it to be one. I made a note, in my hand, deliberately, so I would recognize it as new, and moved on to Theta 10, and did not think of it again for 11 days, which is how long it took for the same thing to happen twice more. I should tell you what the ship sounds like at night, though of course there is no night in the belly of a mass conveyor. Only the ship's own decision about when the lumen strips dim to half. During the dim hours, the grain holds are the quietest place on the oak. The engine deck never stops its thrum, and the crew quarters carry the noise of 800 souls trying to sleep in bunks stacked 4 high, and the chapel carries the low murmur of whichever devout soul has drawn the night vigil. But the holds are silent, but for the grain itself, which settles and shifts, with a sound like a very slow, very patient breathing. And it was in that silence, on a night some 3 weeks after the Theta 9 entry, that I heard someone singing. I want to be honest and tell you, it did not frighten me immediately. My first thought, standing in the dark of the central gantry with my lantern throwing a small circle of yellow onto grain that stretched away into black in every direction, was that one of the pious ratings had wandered down for a private devotion, which is not unheard of. Some men like to pray where the emperor's bounty is stored, rather than where his image is painted. The tune was slow, almost a dirge. I did not recognize the words, only fragments. Something about a debt paid in the dark, something about the 9th hour, something about grain that does not rot because it is owed to something older than the harvest. And I remember standing very still and listening longer than I should have, because there was a comfort in it. The way there is comfort in any hymn even when you cannot place it, and it was only when the singing stopped mid-phrase, cut clean as a vox link severed, that the hair on my arms rose, and I understood I had been listening to something I was not meant to hear. I asked the chaplain about it. Not directly. You do not go to a ministorum confessor and say you heard something singing in the dark. Not on a ship where 3 menials were flogged the previous year for unsanctioned devotional practice, which is the polite Administratum phrase for singing something that was not on the approved hymnal list. I asked instead, in the confessional queue, in the vague way a man asks about a superstition rather than a fact, whether there was a hymn sung only rarely aboard the oak, something about debts and the 9th hour. The chaplain, an old man named Pallasferro, who has heard my confessions for 6 years and knows me well enough to know I do not usually ask idle questions, went very still, the particular stillness of a man deciding how much of the truth is safe to give. He told me there was a hymn catalogued in the ship's approved liturgy as Hymnal 88 Theta, sung once a decade, at a service he himself had never conducted and did not know the words to. because the rite belonged to the ship's senior chaplain alone and was performed in private. He said this the way a man recites a regulation he has never questioned, and then he told me, and I remember this exactly, because it was the first time in 11 years that Palace Pharaoh looked at me with something other than the tired kindness of a confessor. He told me that I should not concern myself with hymns I had not been taught, because a man who learns a rite before his station permits it sometimes finds he has learned more than the words. I did not understand what he meant. I understand it now. The tally began the week after that, though I did not think of it as a tally at first. I was reconciling the tithe ledger against the grain count, which is a duty that falls to the grain wardens once a quarter. A tedious business of matching cogitator output against handwritten inventory to satisfy an Administratum audit function that exists, as far as any of us can tell, purely so that somewhere on Holy Terror a scribe can stamp a form and file it. In the ledger's rearmost pages, past the grain totals and the tithe percentages and the moisture logs, there is a column that has no heading. It has always had no heading. I had noticed it perhaps 100 times over the years and assumed it was a printing error. A column left blank by whichever forge on whichever world had stamped the ledger's template, because Administratum forms are full of such errors. Empty fields and duplicated headers and instructions in a low Gothic dialect 3 centuries out of date. The column contained a single tally mark for every voyage the ship had completed since her commissioning. I had never counted them. That quarter, reconciling figures with my chalk and my patience wearing thin, I counted them, because the number of marks did not match the number of voyages listed in the Oak's service record, which I had once been shown in full during my induction. The way every new hand is shown the ship's history so he understands what he has joined. There were more tally marks than voyages, 4 more to be exact. 4 marks with no voyage to account for them, sitting quietly in a column with no name, in a ledger nobody reads past the totals. On a ship where record-keeping is supposed to be the one thing that never lies. Because the Administratum's entire reason for existing is the belief that if enough is written down, nothing true can ever be lost. I want to tell you I went to someone in authority immediately. I did not. I want to tell you I was frightened in the dramatic way men are frightened in the stories told around a mess hall table late at night. With wide eyes and a shaking voice. I was not. What I felt, if I am honest, was something closer to the feeling of finding a door in a house you have lived in your whole life. A door you had somehow never noticed, and understanding, all at once, that the house is larger than you believed, and that the new rooms are not necessarily rooms you wanted. It was Iset Cray, the Grain Warden of the deck below mine, who told me about the role. She had been aboard the Oak longer than I had, 19 years to my 11. And she had the particular flatness of manner that long service on a grain hauler gives a person, as though the 2 kilometers of dark and grain dust had worn the surprise off her, the way water wears a stone. I told her about the ledger entry in my own hand that I had not written. I did not tell her about the singing, because even then, some part of me understood the singing was a private thing, meant only for whoever was meant to hear it, and I was ashamed of having heard it. She listened without much reaction, and then she told me that every soul lost aboard the Oak, to accident, to plague, to the small violences that 800 people crammed into a metal hull for years at a time will occasionally do to one another, has their name entered into the roll of the faithful departed, which hangs in the chapel behind glass, illuminated by a single votive lumen that never goes dark, so that the emperor's servants are never truly forgotten, even after their bodies are given to the reclamation furnace. She told me to go and read it. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the account where I stop being a man describing strange coincidences and become a man describing something I cannot make sense of by any ordinary reckoning. And I have turned this moment over more times than I have turned any other moment in my life, trying to find the crack in it, the place where a rational explanation might still fit. I have not found one. I offer you what I found instead. The roll is long. 800 souls over 11 years produces more names than you would think, because a hauler like the oak loses perhaps 30 a year to sickness, to the void, to the grinding attrition of a life spent in a metal box between the stars. The names are added in a careful, uniform hand. A servitor does the actual inscription, one of the old scribe thralls kept for exactly this purpose, its remaining organic eye fixed, and its cogitated memory, holding nothing but the correct penmanship for a roll of the dead. I read down the list under the single steady votive light, past names I recognized. An engine rating who had died of a fever in my second year aboard, a chaplain's assistant lost to a fall from the upper gantry, and then, near the bottom, in a section dated some 4 years before I was born on my home world, and could have had any possible reason to be aboard a ship I would not join for another 2.5 decades. Ansel Voth, my name, my exact name, in the servitor's careful uniform hand, with a death date under the ship's own reckoning that made no sense against any calendar I could reconstruct. Because the oak's internal chronometer runs on a cycle unique to her own long transit, decoupled from any planetary calendar the moment she leaves a berth, and reconciling it against a birth date on a world I have not seen in 11 years is not the kind of arithmetic a Grain Warden is trained for. I stood in the chapel a long time. The votive lumen did not flicker, because it never does. That is the entire purpose of it, and I remember thinking, with a calm that frightens me more in memory than anything else in this account, that a votive light which is never permitted to go dark is itself a kind of forgetting, because a flame that never gutters gives you no way to mark how much time has passed beneath it. I asked the servitor scribe whether it made errors. It cannot answer conversational questions, of course. A scribe thrall's remaining vocal function is limited to liturgical recitation and basic acknowledgement codes. But it turned its fixed eye toward me, and its vox grill produced, unbidden, a fragment of the litany for the newly departed. The specific verse reserved for a soul whose service is not yet concluded. I had heard that verse read over the dead, perhaps 24 times in my service. I had never heard it offered to a name on the roll unprompted, by a machine with no capacity for volition, standing before a name that was mine. I did not sleep for 3 shifts after that. I want you to understand that I am not a man given to fright. I have walked 2 kilometers of pitch-dark grain hold for 11 years, with nothing but a lantern for company. And I have never once believed the old stories the deckhands tell about things that live in the deep silos. Because I have opened every silo on this ship 100 times over, and found nothing in any of them but grain and weevils, and the particular cold that settles into unheated iron. But a man's own name on a death roll, in a ledger that does not lie, dated to a time he cannot account for, is not a story told over recaf. It is a fact, sitting where a fact has no business sitting, and I found I could not simply walk past it the way I had walked past the strange ledger entry and the strange hymn. So I did the thing I should perhaps have done from the start, and went looking for the old logs. The oak keeps her full manifest and voyage record in the cogitator vault beneath the command deck, a chamber I had cause to enter perhaps 3 times in 11 years, always on some clerical errand for the grain master, always under supervision. I did not have clearance to search the deep archive alone, and I want to be honest that what I did next was not entirely within the bounds of my station, but a man who has found his own death recorded on a ship he is still walking will forgive himself a great deal in pursuit of an answer. I told the archive menial on duty. A boy named Tobrin, who owed me a favor from a moisture reading I had once falsified on his behalf to save him a docking of pay, that I needed the Theta 9 maintenance history for an inspection report. He let me into the terminal and left to fetch his supper, as young men will, and I searched, in the 20 minutes he was gone, for every record the Oak's cogitator held under the name Voth. There were 4 entries. 4 voyages, going back, as best I could reconstruct against the ship's own drifting internal calendar, across some 200 years of the Oak's service, each one listing a Grain Warden named Voth, each one ending the same way, a notation, in the flat administrative low Gothic of a redaction order, that the individual service record beyond a certain date was sealed under Administratum directive. Memory of the crew, regarding the individual's final months to be considered non-continuous for operational cohesion. I did not know then what that meant. I understand it now, and I wish I did not. I went back to the grain holds that same shift, because a man with a fear in him will often return to the place the fear began, as though facing it again might shrink it. I walked to Theta 9 with my lantern held higher than usual, and I opened the silo door, and there, in the grain, in a hollow I had walked past 400 times without once noticing it was there, was a shape. I will describe what I saw as plainly as I can, because embellishment would be a disservice to the truth of it. It was not a monster, in the sense the deckhand's stories would have you expect. No claws, no teeth. Nothing that could be painted on a devotional icon as a warning to children. It was a depression in the grain, a hollow the exact size and shape of a man curled on his side, as though someone had lain there long enough for the grain to remember the shape of him, and radiating from that hollow, in a spiral pattern too regular to be the settling of any natural harvest, were furrows in the grain that looked, more than anything else, like the marks a hand makes when it is dragged slowly and repeatedly across a surface by something that does not tire. I did not go closer. I want to record that plainly, because a braver account might have me kneeling in the grain to investigate, and I did not. I stood at the threshold with my lantern shaking in my grip, and I understood, and with the particular clarity that comes only in the worst moments of a life, that I had found the place where the 4 other men named Voth had lain, and that the ledger entries in my own hand, the hymn I had heard, the tally marks with no voyage, and my own name on the roll of the departed, were not 4 separate mysteries but a single mechanism, turning slowly, the way the grain lifts turn, on a schedule that had nothing to do with the ship's official calendar, and everything to do with something much older than the oak herself. I went to Chaplain Pharaoh that night, out of hours, against every protocol of the confessional queue, and I told him everything, the ledger, the hymn, the roll, the hollow in the grain. And I watched the old man's face move through several expressions before settling on something I can only call grief. The specific grief of a man who has been waiting a long time for a question he did not want to answer. He told me the truth, or as much of it as the ship's oldest rights permit any single soul to hold. The oak had not always hauled grain alone. 2 centuries passed, in a crossing gone wrong, a warp storm that should have taken the ship entire. The kind of storm that leaves nothing behind but a name on a memorial and a gap in the fleet manifest. Her captain of the age had made a bargain, the details of which no living soul aboard fully possesses, because the bargain itself demands that its details be forgotten as the price of its keeping. Something had been taken aboard in that storm, in the deep grain, something old beyond any dating the tech priests could offer, something that did not eat grain and did not need to, because what it fed on instead was time and memory, and the particular substance of a man's remembered self. In exchange for the ship's survival, a portion of that substance would be given, on a cycle unknown to any but the senior chaplain who inherited the right, from a soul chosen not by cruelty, but by a kind of terrible accounting. The same accounting that fills a nameless column in a ledger nobody reads. The gift was not death, Pharaoh told me, and his voice broke on the words in a way I had never heard from him in 11 years of confessions. It was worse than death, because death is at least final, and this was not. The chosen soul continued to walk the ship, continued to perform their duties, continued to eat and sleep and speak, hollowed slowly across months, by a fraction taken each cycle at the 9th hour, in the deep silo, in the ritual disguised aboard the oak as nothing more sinister than a routine atmospheric benediction, a rite performed weekly over the recycled air of the grain decks, ostensibly to purify the harvest of taint. In truth, releasing into that air a mind-fogging vapor that scrubbed from the wider crew's memory any clear recollection of the chosen soul's decline, so that by the time the gift was complete, the ship's 800 souls remembered only a colleague who had transferred away, or fallen sick and been quietly reassigned to a quieter deck, and the Administratum's own automated ledgers, keyed to the same rite, sealed the true record behind a redaction order that no menial clearance could ever open. And the reason I alone, of 800 souls, had noticed what should have been erased from me as cleanly as from anyone else, was an accident so small it might have been overlooked by whatever intelligence governs the bargain, an augmetic lung, catching and altering the weekly vapor just enough that some fraction of what it was meant to erase in me instead simply blurred and lingered, and eventually began to surface as fragments too strange to ignore. I was not the first Voth to walk this ship. I understood that now, standing in the chaplain's small cell with the truth laid bare between us, I was, in some sense the old man could not fully explain, and perhaps did not fully understand himself, a continuation, a name the ship's own accounting returned to across the centuries, the way water returns to the lowest point of a hold. Because a bargain sealed once must be paid on schedule, and something about the shape of that debt, the exact fraction owed, the exact hollow in the exact grain, favored, across 200 years. An unbroken line of ordinary men who had never once met one another and did not know they shared a blood I could not trace and a name I had believed. Until that night was entirely my own. The next cycle, Pharaoh told me, was 11 days away. I will not pretend to you that I spent those 11 days in noble contemplation. I spent the first 3 in something close to panic, walking the upper decks in the hours I should have been sleeping, weighing every foolish plan a frightened man weighs, desertion at the next port, an appeal to the ship's master that I knew would be treated as the ravings of a menial, overdue for a psych evaluation, even. In my worst hour, the thought of destroying the ledger itself, as though burning the record could unmake the debt it recorded. None of it held. A grain hauler 4 years from any berth offers nowhere to desert to. A ship's master who has served the bargain's silence for decades of his own career is not a man who will thank a grain warden for naming it aloud. And a debt owed to something that eats memory does not, I came to understand, care in the least what is written or unwritten in a ledger. The ledger only ever recorded what the thing had already taken. It was on the 8th day that Tobrin came to me, the archive menial, the boy whose favor I had once earned with a falsified moisture reading, and told me, in the careful, frightened voice of a young man who has noticed something he was never meant to notice, that his own logbook, the one he keeps for the archive vault's environmental readings, had an entry in his hand from a shift he did not remember working. I understood, hearing him say it, that the ship's accounting had already moved past me. I do not know whether it was because Pharaoh's confession to me had somehow disturbed the mechanism's usual quiet, or because the fraction it required next simply fell, by whatever cruel logic governs it, to a different vessel than an aging grain warden with a faulty lung, a vessel younger and with more years of memory left to give. I only knew that the boy had 11 years ahead of him that I did not, and a mother somewhere on a hive world who still believed he was coming home, and that I had spent 11 years of my own life walking 2 kilometers of grain in the dark without ever once being asked to give anything more than my labor, which felt, in that moment, very much like a mercy I had not earned and did not deserve to keep for myself alone. I went to Pharaoh a final time and told him what I intended, and the old man wept, which I had not expected of him, and did not try to stop me, which I had expected even less. On the 9th day, at the 9th hour, I went down to Theta 9 alone, without my lantern, because I found, standing at the silo door, that I no longer wanted the light. I do not know precisely what passed between myself and the hollow in the grain in the time that followed, because this is the one part of the account where my own memory, faulty lung or no, offers me nothing but fragments. A warmth that was not warmth, a weight settling into the space behind my eyes. The hymn from hymnal 88 Theta, rising around me, not sung by any voice I could locate, but simply present. The way the ship's engine thrum is always present, felt in the bones before it is heard. I understood, somewhere in the middle of it, that I was choosing the shape my own forgetting would take, and that this was the only freedom the bargain had ever offered any Voth before me, not to refuse the debt, which no soul aboard the Oak has ever been shown how to refuse, but to choose, once, who would not have to pay it in your place. I woke, if waking is the word, in the grain hold's central gantry, my ledger in my hand. A fresh entry in my own careful slant, already filling the Theta 9 moisture column for a shift I do not remember working. Dated 11 days from now, I do not know how many cycles I have left in me. I do not know whether the boy Tobrin will grow old on this ship as an archive menial, and never once notice a strange entry in his own hand, the way 800 other souls have never noticed across 2 centuries, or whether some flaw in his own body, some accident of birth or injury, will one day let a fragment of the truth surface in him as it surfaced in me, and whether he will find, if it does, some other soul to spare in his turn. I do not know whether the Emperor's grace extends to a bargain sealed before I was born, in a storm I never sailed through, for a debt I did not create and cannot end. I know only that the oak sails on, that the grain is dry and free of rot, that the tithe is always met, and that somewhere in her deep and patient hold, a hymn I was never taught continues to keep its private hour, and that I have written this account in my own hand, on this 6th day, at this bell, so that if some future Grain Warden should ever find it tucked behind the loose plating of Theta 9's inspection hatch, he will understand, before the ledger writes itself again in his own careful hand, that the forgetting was never an accident of the voyage. It was always, from the very first storm, the price of it.